Hi everyone. Oh cool, it's working, yay. It's so nice to see a room full of people in this very orange kind of room, and a little bit of kind of precarious items around. So I'm going to try and stay in this safe zone while I talk. I'm going to talk about data ethics and emerging technologies, and basically I would like everyone to make art and not surveillance tech. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own creative practice, a little bit about what it means to have a human rights approach to building technology and using technology, and a couple of practical tools for you to take away and use with your own projects. But first, this is kind of me on a page, if we haven't crossed paths before. I'm Kat. I'm a Nyungar technologist, writer, and digital rights activist. I grew up on the south coast of WA. So that's where my mob are from. My old people are Mirning from South Australia. I'm interested in custodial approaches to data management and interrogating systems of surveillance, and using creative technology as a liberatory practice. I am a big HTML, CSS, and JavaScript fan for making just about everything, and I think that learning how to code is the tool to our sovereignty. And I'm currently working as the campaigns and advocacy manager at a not-for-profit called Digital Rights Watch, where I champion a human rights-based approach to privacy and online safety, which is what I'll talk a little bit about. So this is where I operate, this kind of like Venn diagram of science fiction, digital rights, and creative technology. So you can find me kind of like in the middle somewhere. I'll share a couple of creative projects I've worked on recently. This one is called Dazzle, that I worked on with artist Video Run for Runway magazine a couple of years ago, and it's a kind of like an online work of gameplay and live performance journey for one. Your mission is to escort this orb around the internet and completing a series of nonsense tasks to its final resting place, and tasks like posting a strange image to your Instagram feed with no caption and drawing a picture of the orb with a virtual Etch-a-Sketch. And what we wanted to interrogate what ways our behaviors towards technology are algorithmically determined, and what is the difference between a curatorial and a custodial approach to technology and data management. We wanted to play with this position of curator versus custodian and understand, like, why does it feel so weird to use a platform in ways that it wasn't designed to. And this is a recent sculptural project that's in an exhibition in Westspace in Num at the moment, called My Voice Identifies Me. These are 3D printed sculptures modelled by different sound waves that I kind of pulled into Blender and curved into these little low-spired shells. There are 3 different sound waves. One of them is an old recording of my grandfather from the 60s. He's talking and speaking in language, and I have this collection of cassettes that are kind of the only archival material I have of my granddad and of the languages that he used to speak, and I don't want to publish it on a platform somewhere for everyone to share. Like, I want it to be available to my family and my community and my cousins and aunties, but they're kind of precious items and precious objects and sacred knowledges and stories. So one way for me to be able to solidify or materialize that cultural component or that cultural material is by turning it into these shells. The middle shell, the middle sculpture, is a recording of me saying, "In Australia, my voice identifies me," over and over. I mean, some of you who have engaged with Centrelink will be familiar with it. It's the phrase that Centrelink get you to say to create a voice print for yourself when you're engaging with online services. So I wanted to kind of show this act of surveilling ourselves, of capturing a part of ourselves, a biometric kind of footprint, and the ways that we engage with technologies can be kind of capturing. I want to come back to this phrase, boorda, the phrase that is kind of capturing this program that we're working on, Future Now, and I want to think about the ways that we're kind of ushering in the future and the ways that we can differently think about the future and create it together. So the other thing that I do is I write science fiction. That's mostly what I'm doing these days. I have a piece in this anthology called This All Come Back Now, and I do really think that writing science fiction and speculative fiction is a way, especially for Indigenous peoples, to imagine ourselves in the future and imagine futures in which we are thriving. And that act in itself is a radical thing to do in a country and in a society that wanted to eradicate us. So I like to use speculative fiction making, whether it's in literature or in art making or in sculptures, to be able to imagine these different futures and chart a path for how to get there. But I'm also very mindful that so much of science fiction is dystopian and written by a very specific kind of person. Like all the science fiction I read growing up was by white men, no offense, but a lot of dystopian fiction as well is taken by tech bros in Silicon Valley who read things like Snow Crash and Neuromancer and interpret them as blueprints rather than warning signs. So there is this really like permeable interface between art making and very tangible impacts on society. So whatever we make in our art and in our creative practice, that can have a very material impact on the world. So if you're not familiar with this tweet, this is one of my favorite things on the internet, which basically like articulates what I'm trying to say about dystopian fictions. It says, sci-fi author, in my book, I have invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the torment nexus from classic sci-fi novel, don't create the torment nexus. And so that's what I'd really like to happen in the next few months, that we create things together, that we're working with emerging technologies and new technologies, is that we don't create the torment nexus. But art has this way of influencing industry. And one thing I really hope people take away is that technology is not neutral. I have people telling me quite frequently, oh, it's not the technology, it's how you use it, even that data is neutral. But none of it is. Like, technology has politics, it is built with materials mined from country, all of the machines that we use were made by particular people for a particular purpose. So it's just something that is always buried in the back of my brain, is this way to resist against the neutrality of technology. I don't expect you to kind of like grok all of the detail on this slide, but this is a piece called Anatomy of an AI System by Kate Crawford, and it's one of my favorite examples or illustrations of the way that both the materiality of technology and the human labor and the invisible costs of technology are kind of extricated. This is a life cycle of an Amazon Echo. So those things that Amazon recently changed the privacy settings so that your data is no longer encrypted on device but sent to the cloud. But basically it goes through like, how are the materials mined from country and whose labor is involved. It's usually labor from the global south. Where do the data centers live? How is water and rare earth minerals combined into creating these things and then eventually end up in landfill in the bottom right. So as consumers, we often see an object as it is presented to us in a store in our mailbox, and we see its packaging, and sometimes we see its internal organs if we rip it apart, but the wider journey is usually obfuscated and hidden by design. So the journey of mining materials from the global south to training data, developing neural networks, all the way to end-of-life processes, which usually involves products being thrown into landfill, and again in countries in the global south. And I like to come back to this map as a reminder of the hidden processes of technology. So what does this mean in relation to art making and creative practices? So I mentioned I work for a not-for-profit called Digital Rights Watch. We're a charity organisation that was founded to promote and defend human rights as realised in the digital age. So digital rights are basically human rights as they manifest online, and we stand for privacy, democracy, fairness, and freedom. So I want to take some of the things that I use in my day job to help us understand or put into context the way that we use technology. And what do I mean by a human rights approach is basically how are human rights, such as our right to privacy, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of assembly, impacted by technology, both in the way that we use technology and the way that we develop it. And basically, the cornerstone is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia like the United States does, so we don't have a federally enshrined right to privacy, right to freedom of speech. So we tend to fall back on this international declaration, and these are basically the main principles where our human rights and technology kind of interface together. So protection from arbitrary interference with privacy, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Basically, our right to assemble, to protest, to be with others, to engage in political activism, freedom of thought and conscience and religion, rights and fairness in criminal justice processes and public participation. But I'll focus more on the three on the right. So basically like privacy, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly and association. So these are the I guess like the modes of inquiry through which we can interrogate like what are the ways that technology can harm us or that we can harm others with technology. So in my work, I pay specific attention to facial recognition technology and other surveillance technology and other biometric surveillance technology, data collection more broadly, and generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Midjourney. I've allowed myself one slide on generative AI just to get like a little bit of, here's my beef with generative AI. So if in a world we can solve for all these things, then I can be okay with people using generative AI tools, but in the present moment, this is my beef with them. So large language models like ChatGPT and Midjourney are trained on data that has been stolen from artists without consent, credit, or compensation. I know a lot of writers at the moment, like presently, are dealing with the fact that they're learning that Meta have trained their large language models with copyright materials that have been stolen from pirated books. So there's a class action in the US happening at the moment. And I know Sam Altman's been in the news saying, well, if I can't use stolen data, then I don't have a business model, and that's a bit boo-hoo. So that's beef number one. And data curation and moderation relies on human labor, usually unpaid or underpaid, workers, again, in the global south. And that is a huge hidden cost that's usually subsidized or obfuscated. Data centers use water and electricity in abundance. They're threatening many communities' access to electricity and water wherever a new data center is kind of propped up on country. There are some unique privacy and data protection risks when using generative AI tools, both as a consumer and at the point where data is kind of fed into large language models. I'd say that generative AI is kind of antithetical to privacy. Generative AI requires access to as much data as possible, and the more you try to uphold your rights, the more you threaten generative AI tools. And then one thing that comes up a lot is the way that biased data sets amplify discrimination. And I've been in conversation with people in the tech industry before who say, well, we need more data, we need access to more diverse data and diverse data sets. We need more people or diverse teams working on these tools, and that whenever I hear that, like, oh, we just need more data, I come back to this quote from Julia Powell's, who wrote this excellent piece called The Seductive Diversion of Solving Bias in Artificial Intelligence. And she says, when underlying systemic issues remain fundamentally untouched, the bias fighters simply render humans more machine-readable, exposing minorities in particular to additional harms. So I'm very careful about this idea that we can solve bias with more data, because that is what we end up doing. We end up making people more machine-readable. We end up confining people to data points as well, and I often wonder, like, what is lost when we are compressed into ones and zeros. I took this photo at the National Communications Museum in Nam a couple of months ago. It's I don't know if you can see the text, but there's a big round box around my face that just says angry. And this is one of those tools that's designed to, I guess, like, approximate emotions. It's a kind of like facial recognition technology. And these are the kinds of tools we might be playing around with and might be thinking, like, oh, that's so neat, especially when we're working with, like, visual identification or other biometric identification, or even mocap, and other biometric data collection. So these questions are the ones that I use to interrogate, like, what are the risks? Like, what are the consequences of rendering ourselves through technology, and what can be captured, and also what is lost when we're using these kinds of tools. Maybe. Is it working? And then there's kind of like this through point between the tools that we use in our creative practices and smart cities and surveillance. There are plenty of companies that would love to take whatever new development or innovation that we create in our creative practices and put them on cameras around the city, because there are many people who are interested in being able to better identify people in crowds or people in war zones. So I want to question, like, what data is being collected, where is it being stored, and what kind of chilling effects can occur, especially in public spaces where people want to assemble, want to gather, want to protest. So these are my principles for data collection. Just generally, there are some broader, like, longer rules around privacy and data collection, but these are the three. It should be 1, 2, 3, not 1, 1, 1, although they are all important. So firstly, only collect what data is necessary. I think I worked in the tech industry for a long time, so I worked with a lot of clients and companies who just, like, wanted to collect everything as much as possible, which I think is, like, unethical firstly, and a waste of data warehousing space. But firstly, yeah, only collect what you need for your project. Secondly, tell people what you're collecting, not only for the ethics of consent, but then your subjects, the people that you're working with on your project, can have agency over what is collected as well. And I never want to be surprised about how much data is collected about myself. And thirdly, only use data for the purpose in which it is collected. This is called a use limitation. But basically, personal information should only be used and disclosed for the purpose for which it was collected. Otherwise, there's consent and other legal issues to consider. The other big thing I would like people to take away is that technological progress is not linear, and there is nothing inevitable about technology. There is so much more emerging technology and interesting technology coming out other than large language models and generative AI that I would love to see people play with. I feel like a lot of Gen AI tools has sucked the oxygen from the room, both in the creative industries, but also the tech industry more largely. And I'd love to see people playing with different things. But yeah, there is nothing inevitable about any kind of technology, even though that is something that I feel like we're being told every day, like, don't worry, it's already here, especially when it comes to tools like OpenAI and ChatGPT. But yeah, these technologies are sucking up an enormous amount of capital and oxygen in the room right now, and I think there is a a feeling of like, don't be left behind if you decide not to use or adopt a certain technology, but I just don't believe that to be the case at all. In case, who is familiar with the Gartner hype cycle? This is basically this graph over time of understanding the way that many, especially emerging technologies, kind of capture space in society and capture space in our collective imaginations. And I kind of feel like generative AI is cresting this peak of inflated expectations, and I suspect we will fall into this trough of disillusionment over time. And then maybe generative AI tools and large language models will find a kind of stable point in the tech industry. The thing I want to leave you with is a couple of really practical tools for dystopian speculation, for asking what could go wrong and anticipating what could go wrong and mitigating those risks. And the first one is one thing I like to do in my tech teams is conducting a pre-mortem. So instead of a post-mortem where you kind of assess what went wrong and how the thing died, and you can conduct a pre-mortem, which is where you imagine yourself in the future. You engage in this kind of time traveling 1 month after your project has launched and imagine that everything went completely wrong and it was a huge disaster, and you work backwards and think, okay, well, what happened? My teams don't like doing this, but it's good for them, and I think it's good for creative projects as well. So you basically make a big list, like, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like, we run out of money, there's no electricity, there's no like power points in the space where we want to install, there's a shipping problem, I don't know, that someone has cut the undersea cables and we have no internet in the entire country. And then you work backwards and think, okay, well, what can we do to prevent this from happening and who's responsible? It's just a risk mitigation exercise, but I think they're fun because I like dystopian science fiction, and this is basically dystopian science fiction for tech teams. And the second one is conducting a threat model, which is a tool, a risk-based exercise for understanding security, and you can do this as an individual person. I've done this with activist groups. It's basically understanding your system and designing a secure system. So especially if you're working with personal information or other data, if you're working with marginalized communities, or anything that you care about protecting, I think it's worth building a threat model. And this is basically how I would do it on a page. So 5 things, you basically make a list of what do I have that is worth protecting. So it might be physical assets, it might be your phone, your computer, documents on your hard drive, passwords, any kind of sensitive information about your collaborators, communication. So what kind of comms platform are you using? Are you chatting over SMS? Are you using an app? Are you using social media? And then try and figure out, like, who do I want to protect it from? Are you doing work that is politically sensitive? Are there bad actors, or are there adversaries? Are there government agencies or corporations that you don't want to get hands on your data or your working material? And how likely is it that I will need to protect it? Like, how trustworthy are the people in your network? How highly sensitive is the information? Do you work with someone politically exposed? I think this is one that I would pay most attention to. And how bad are the consequences? If I fail, will someone be deported? Will there be a personal risk? Is there a financial risk? Is there a cost involved? How bad would it be if someone stole, corrupted, or deleted your data or your working material? And finally, how much effort am I willing to go through to prevent these consequences? So it's a balancing exercise of cost, convenience, privacy, and security. And before I wrap up, I want to come back to reiterating that we are on country and all of the work that we make is on country, whether or not we're working with physical or digital technologies, data is stored somewhere, machines are made with materials that are mined from country, and they have a politics, and they have that kind of situatedness, and they have a materiality. So I would love to see, how does our art making respond to country, and how does it have that reflexive or reciprocal relationship with country, and what are the material components even for digital artworks that we're working with. So we are on Wardrobe Kunua Buja, and that isn't just a phrase that we use at the beginning of engagements, but it is something very integral to our art making. So yeah, boorda yeyi. I just want to come back to this phrase again because I love it so much, and I'm really excited to see what we build together. But future now, immersive technology, speculative thinking, and thank you all so much. Thank you for paying attention. Enjoy the rest of the program.